One of the greatest threats that we as a collective human society face today is the climate crisis. Today, some of the greatest advocates of change when it comes to the environment, both in terms of individual and corporate action, are young people. And historically, advocates of environmental reform have come from all walks of life, hoping to make the world a safer place for their families and the future of their communities. There are a lot of places that we could choose to begin this particular discussion. One would be with indigenous resistance to overhunting of the buffalo. Another might be with the establishment of the National Park Service in the Progressive Era. But in the post-World War II era, one of the defining moments for the environmentalist movement was the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962. In her book, which she adapted to make more sense for popular audiences, Carson explained her scientific study which proved that pesticides, including DDT, the super common one used by pretty much everyone, were harmful. One of the ways that she did this was by exposing birds, chickens if I recall, to the chemical and then comparing their eggs. Those exposed to the pesticides had thin, if not non-existent shells around the eggs that they laid. What then, she argued, was happening to people that were exposed to this? When she studied that effect, the answer was understandably not good. And this was a huge problem because ever since the 1940s, DDT was used pretty much everywhere. Like you can see in the advertisement here, people used to spray it in their cabinets to keep bugs out of the house. Local governments literally sprayed it from planes over neighborhoods to keep bugs away during the summer. And the US government literally sprayed it on immigrant workers during the Bracero program as they worked in the fields, which you can see in the image at the bottom. So this was sprayed in direct contact with surfaces that people would touch, on people's bodies, and even into the same water reservoirs that provided drinking water, which led to a federal ban on the substance a decade later. But this wasn't the only thing to come out of this. The study also noted toxic waste dumps from businesses and government facilities that were poured into ponds and lakes, which were then so hazardous that they would literally catch fire, sometimes just on their own because of the mixture of chemicals that were there. And so, much like the muckraking journalism of the Progressive Era, Carson's book led to others showing their similar findings and then led to a call for reform. And that reform came in the form of the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. Today, the EPA has two main jobs: to pass and maintain regulations on pollution and emissions, and to educate the public on environmentally friendly practices. The first of those jobs is harder than it seems because the EPA is under the authority of the president. So with each administration, the president can choose to enact or roll back EPA standards as he or she wishes. And so this means that every 4 to 8 years, the EPA can be dealing with a whole new set of rules and goals that they're expected to meet. Or the president might go to an international meeting where they agree to a new set of goals for meeting national standards for pollution, but then the next administration chooses not to follow that. And so the EPA has to be ready and be flexible. Their second job is to educate the public. There are a lot of ways that they tend to do this. One of the ways is through grants to local schools to help teachers provide tools to help educate students on conservation and waste management. Another is by producing updated data that keeps people aware of what our national footprint is, or in other words, what our environmental impact is as a country. There are also ways that individuals can calculate their individual ecological footprint based on daily behaviors. I'll link one of these on our Canvas page so that you can find out yours. But one of the biggest things we have to realize about tracking our progress as a nation is that in order to show real progress on the global scale, it truly does have to be a national effort. It's great that each individual person recycles, or that some people choose to be vegan or buy cage-free eggs, which aren't actually what you think they are, but that's a whole other thing. But these things don't actually do a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. Individual people making individual choices for environmental protection are like trying to use a squirt gun to put out a house fire. In theory, you're contributing to the effort, but what's required is really something bigger. And at this point in our fight in environmental protection, what's required is an effort on the biggest causes of environmental distress, which are our massive polluters, manufacturers, oil companies, and transportation companies. Without real action by these groups, we're all trying to stop global warming with a paper fan. Sort of paired with the EPA is the Endangered Species Act, which honestly is one of my favorite laws that we talk about all year. And this does literally exactly what it sounds like. It protects species of animals that are considered endangered as well as the environments that they live in. So if you're ever in an area that's considered protected or that a certain city isn't allowed to build in, it might be because there's a particular tree or type of plant that exists there that's required for the existence of one of these animals. And so some of the animals that are on the list would include the red wolf, the manatee, and the bald eagle. Each of these animals is endangered for a different reason. For example, manatees tend to live in very shallow water in the Florida Gulf and Keys region, which means that they're endangered of being hit by boats. Their environment has also been disrupted by boating and tourism. Red wolves have been hunted to near extinction. Sometimes zoos and other places will try to alleviate some of these problems by creating safe zones for more breeding, but this isn't always an available option and takes years to do successfully in order to get a species off the list. But the Endangered Species Act and the EPA were just two of a whole line of environmentalist actions passed under the Nixon administration, including the Clean Air Act. It's not that Nixon was an avid outdoorsman, but more that he saw the environment was something that people were starting to care about and had the political forethought to not stand in the way. And in doing so, he laid the groundwork for progress. I'd love to say that this whole thing is just sunshine and rainbows, but it's really not. Super sorry. In the 1950s, there were about 750 uranium mines in the United States, 17 of which were on the Navajo Reservation. Mining stopped in 1967, but today there are still more than about 1,000 abandoned uranium mine shafts on the Navajo land. When they were in use, though, Navajo men worked in the mines since, logically, they were near their homes and were essentially the only place where they could work. Although work is a bit of a loose term when it comes to actually getting paid, since they worked for usually less than the minimum wage, most making anywhere from 81 cents to $1 per hour in 1949. And this entire time, the men were being exposed to cancer. And the government knew this. They'd known about it since the 30s. Sure enough, in the 60s, the first cases of lung cancer started appearing in Navajo miners. Before this, the Navajo community didn't really experience a lot of lung cancer. After all, they smoked tobacco on average a lot less than white people. After years of gathering data and evidence, their claims to the government resulted in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, which gave a one-time cash payment of $100,000 to uranium miners who developed a disease. Even still, though, radioactive materials enter the water of the Navajo Reservation and impact the community there. Teenagers there are 17 times more likely to have cancer than teens in other parts of the country. And as of now, they have no recourse for their injustice. And this is the way that environmental racism works. Communities with the least resources to fight bad and racist environmental policies are forced into accepting these policies, knowingly or not. And then years or decades after, bearing the weight of them, the same communities are left with few, if any, resources to deal with the aftermath of the environmental effects on them. Often these effects are health-related issues that can wipe out entire generations or prevent other generations from going to school or work and providing a future for themselves. And then when they go to the government for help in terms of a stimulus or even basic medical care to aid the disease the government caused, they're often called out for not being contributing members of society, which then leads to further exploitation. Wash, rinse, repeat. Nuclear waste seeping into the water supply should be terrifying enough, but since it's not happening to white people, it doesn't tend to get national attention. What did get national attention pretty much immediately was the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979. So 3 Mile Island is exactly what it sounds like, an island, roughly 3 miles, in Pennsylvania, or I guess right off Pennsylvania. And on this island is a nuclear power plant, because one of the things that we decide to do with nuclear power once we figure out how it works is use it to power our cities. And this only increases in demand after the energy crisis in the mid-1970s. So what happens here is a meltdown of the power core, which actually might have been partially avoided if not for human error. And after the initial problem is solved, there's a second problem of a huge bubble of hydrogen gas that had exploded within the reactor. Pregnant women and young children within a 5-mile radius were told to evacuate, which was super unfortunate for local officials because they were definitely hoping to avoid a panic. President Jimmy Carter arrived to inspect the scene within days, which was calming for people since he was also actually a nuclear engineer, which is actually wild because we never think about that side of Jimmy Carter since they're always playing up the peanut farmer side of him. But Jimmy Carter was totally a nuclear engineer when he was in the Navy. And so he assesses the scene and finds it to be at least not a total disaster, and that more or less makes people calm again. But then in 1986, we have the nuclear incident at Chernobyl, which thankfully for us was in the Ukraine and not the US, but still not great for like global environmentalism. Because when this explodes, and I mean explodes, it sends a cloud of radioactive material into the Earth's atmosphere and spreads that for literally thousands and thousands of miles. And of course, now the town where the plant was is essentially a ghost town. The radiation fallout has made it so that it's completely unsafe to live in and will be unsafe to live in for thousands of years because the land is so irradiated and the water isn't safe to drink. On the right here, you can see in top-down fashion before and after photos of the town. In a lot of ways, today's environmentalist movement doesn't look too different than that of generations past. Young people are fighting for basic access to clean water, air, and soil. Most are fighting against a government bent on environmentally racist policies. But added to that, a new generation of young Americans and young people from across the globe are engaged in political activism, strikes from school, internet campaigns, and other ways of fighting for ecological justice that haven't been done before. And in a world that requires innovative solutions to increasingly dire environmental problems, this is a trend that historians and other scholars will be watching with anticipation.